Today is June 19th, 2025, and my guest is writer and journalist James Marriott of the Times of London, where he's a columnist. His Substack is Cultural Capital. And our topic for today is reading, based on a wonderful piece from his Substack called How to Read and Why. James, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now, I'm a little older than you. As I get older, I come to appreciate and realize how much I love books. And your essay just reminded me one more time. You say you read 1 to 2 books per week, a physical book and another on your Kindle. That's a lot of reading. How do you find that time, and why a physical copy and a Kindle? Those are 2 separate books, right? Those are not a Kindle copy of the paper book.
Sometimes they're 2 separate books, although I've recently got into the bad habit of buying the same book twice in physical form and Kindle, which is...
Done it.
Yeah. I'm not proud of it, but it has happened. Usually, the Kindle book I'm using to get through something a bit more long and difficult. I read before I go to sleep. And I always think it's a bit of a life hack that if you read a Kindle every night before you go to sleep, the lights are out, my girlfriend's gone to sleep, I've got a good half hour to read something a bit more, potentially a little bit more boring, which will ideally both send me to sleep, and also by the end of the week, I'll have read a relatively long, boring book in half-hour increments every night. As to how you can read 1 or 2 books a week, I think it's pretty easy, and I think it's easier than people think. And I imagine it was more common in a time before the internet, but I just try to make time to sit down every evening for half an hour, reading on buses, reading on what we have in London, the Tube, whatever the local transport equivalent is. I'm not sure what that would be. And you can, with little increments, you can build in quite a lot of reading. I think it's a less fabulous feat than it might seem.
But you also write that it's ideal to read 50 pages at a sitting. Do you do that religiously or semi-religiously at least? And explain why that argument gets made.
I don't. So that's actually not my argument. There's another fantastic piece about how to read by a guy called Janan Ganesh in the Financial Times. And he makes the point that if you're not reading 50 pages at a time, you're not really engaged in a book, you'll lose your thread, you'll do that dreadful thing, which I agree exists, where you're reading a book and you read 2 pages here, 2 pages there, you lose the plot and it just never gets finished. I think 50 pages per sitting is somewhat extreme. But I actually do think that since I read that piece, I make more of an effort to hold myself to a bit of a goal. Reading, obviously should be pleasure, but I sometimes find it more pleasurable to give myself a little bit of something to aim for, even if it's just 20 pages, and to just really say, I'll do 20 pages without looking at my phone.
You confess or brag in that piece, your piece, that you got rid of your smartphone, excuse me. Why did you do that, and what's the impact been?
Yeah, I've got to say that is a brag, not a confession. I've written about that a few times. To be honest, it was about reading. The thing that kind of began to depress me a couple of years ago when I got rid of my smartphone was that I've always loved reading since I was a kid. It's probably been something that I would think of as an important part of my personality. And I suddenly realized that I was sort of just spending a lot of time when I should have been reading on my phone. And I sort of thought, if I don't read books and I'm on my smartphone, kind of who even am I? This is not really what I'm about. So I got rid of it. And I mean, there are various ways to do it. And I have a kind of dumb phone. So it's not a full-on Nokia brick. It's somewhere halfway between. So it's got WhatsApp. It's been really good. And I actually have read a lot more. And it really changes the way that you experience the world and you experience reading. Because every time you're on a bus, in the past, I'd have, checked my iPhone. But you're kind of stranded. And you suddenly realize that you've dialed down your distraction environment. And it just makes the kind of pain threshold to opening a book really quite a bit lower. And I found that really good. And I guess I'm lucky to be in a job where I don't necessarily need a smartphone. I know it's not an option for everyone.
So right now, being in the middle of a war here in Israel, I spend a lot of time euphemistically monitoring the situation, a phrase I've started to notice on the internet, which means I'm doom scrolling relentlessly through my feed on Twitter or X and hoping for some news. And 99% of the time, there isn't any, and I'm just wasting time, distracting myself. So I love this idea. I have a problem, which is that I love books. I love physical books. And I spend an immense amount of time reading books, both for EconTalk and my own personal reading, on my phone. So I'm reading on my phone, typically on my Kindle app or on my Books app, a PDF that an author or an editor has sent me to consider for EconTalk. And I've become a little bit addicted to it, but it's not a guilty pleasure. It's a very mixed pleasure because it isn't the same. There's some good things about it, but I love what you've done. And the Kindle is a nice portable substitute that lets you carry a library, and then the physical book for when you don't have connection or for whatever reason. Why would you ever why aren't you reading all your books on the Kindle?
Yeah, I sometimes wonder that. And when I go on holiday with an enormous suitcase full of books, I think my girlfriend often has the same thought. Couldn't this all just be on one Kindle? It's interesting what you say about reading books on your phone. And I mean, there are definitely much worse things to do on your phone. And if you're going to read books in them, that's probably one of the better things. But there is various studies about how much information people absorb from screens versus physical books. And it does seem pretty conclusive that you absorb more information from a physical book. And because I do both so much, I do think it's the case. I do think I get more out of a physical book. It also makes reading a bit more of an event. Reading's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be a hobby. And I think part of what makes it feel like a special thing you can do that's somewhat at odds with the screen-based world of the 21st century is stick your phone in another room, take up this sort of amazingly ancient artifact made of paper in the form that it's been taken up by readers for centuries or millennia, and sit down in a chair with it, and you're recreating the exact experience that human beings have been having for hundreds of years. And I think it's just a lovely thing, and there are all kinds of benefits. Underline stuff, fold down papers. I mean, I treat my books very terribly. People who kind of reverence books like relics will be furious at me, but I kind of really bash them around. I think that's kind of the pleasure of it.
When I was growing up, the screen that people were worried about was the screens that people were worried about were television screens. And my dad was an enormous reader, and he passed that love on to me very directly. And I remember just looking at his books often, and when I was a little boy, 6, 7, 8 years old, and thinking, I can't wait till I can read these. There were some obscure history books that I just was so excited. And when I got old enough to read them, they were dry as dust, and I hated them. But put that to the side. When I read a physical book, I'm connected to my dad. And he used to say when he was talking about television, television's like a new thing. Who knows if it'll last? Books have lasted. Now, a lot of people have predicted their demise, but they are hanging in there. Let's talk about how you choose what to read. How do you pick it? How do you pick them?
Yeah, I dedicated quite a bit of the piece to this question because I think one of the hardest things about being a reader is knowing what to read next. And I think often one of the things that most unfortunately puts people off reading books in general is being recommended the wrong book. And I think people often are unaware of the disparity of quality in books in a given topic. So I had various tips about this because I think you should, I often put like a good, few hours probably cumulatively into trying to find what books to read next if the book isn't jumping out at me. And I think it is something that's worth spending time on. I have a few kind of rules of thumb that I set out in the piece if you're interested in those.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of which I think is to always have your kind of antennae blinking. People that you know and respect who recommend books. If somebody recommends me a good book and I trust them and I think they've got good taste and I think the subject sounds like something that might generally one day interest me, I kind of tend to take a note, even if I don't think I'll read it now. I think it's good to have a sort of bank of things that you can come to because people who recommend good books are pretty rare, and it's worth working out who those people are. Ideally, they've got a bit of the same taste as you and sticking to their recommendations and just kind of jotting down anything they say, even if you'll come to it later, because there is a lot of, I think, misinformation surrounding books. And a lot of people recommend books because they think recommending that book will make them sound clever. I've been guilty of it myself. And I think you have to be careful not to be drawn in by people who are recommending you books they think that they should be recommending you.
I don't want to put you on the spot, so you can duck this question, but is there a book that you want to name that you've recommended that you realized it's not that great, but it makes me feel good to recommend it?
My God, that is an embarrassing question. Do you know
Yeah, you
nothing?
can skip it. Preferably a dead author, by the way, not a
God. I
living
mean,
author.
have I overrepresented how much I've enjoyed some of Dostoevsky's novels? I'm sure I have, to be honest. And
Go ahead.
then I have another kind of useful rule of thumb, which I've developed for nonfiction books, which I think is often really hard to find the right book on a topic. And I think when you're looking in bookshops and when you go on Google and you're kind of thinking, I want to read about Voltaire, what's the book I should read about? I should read to find out about Voltaire. A lot of people are going to be pushing you the most recent Voltaire biography. It's what will probably pop up on Google. It's what ChatGPT might recommend you. It's what Waterstones will stick on the front table, or whatever American bookshop you're at will stick on the front table. But as a reader, I think your priority is not to read the most up-to-date biography of Voltaire. You don't need to know the conclusions to all the academic consensuses on Voltaire or whatever revisionist account of his life is, popped up now. I think you're looking for the best written book, and that's often a little bit harder to find, and is worth Googling what is the best written book on Voltaire. Ask ChatGPT what's the best written book on the subject, and that can actually be quite useful. Ask friends for it, and I think that recency bias often trips a lot of people up, and there are a lot of great books that are still perfectly readable. And if you know to be at PhD level in Voltaire, it's fine.
Well, since you were picking on Dostoevsky, I actually think he's underrated.
Underrated? Oh my God,
Yes,
we're going to have a
is.
fight.
But a similar point is that I much prefer the Constance Garnett translations of Dostoevsky, which are, quote, out of date, old fashioned. I like them much more than the more modern, hipper, the translations that have gotten a lot of attention in recent years. We don't have to say whose they are, but that's kind of a similar point. I like your point about reading 2 books about a topic. Explain what the argument is there.
Yeah, this is again not my advice, but advice that was given to me that I maybe aspire to follow more than ever actually managed to follow. But I think it's true that if you really want to get your head around a subject, read 2 books in it. And it's amazing how much goes in from reading 2 books. Often I would take maybe a drier, more academic book in a subject and a popularizing book and read them simultaneously. I did this recently with Rousseau, French philosopher, who I'm reading
We just
about.
had an episode. It's this week's actually current episode.
Oh, brilliant.
It's on Rousseau. And when I saw you actually mentioned Rousseau, 2 different biographies of Rousseau in your essay, I thought, oh my goodness. I've never read Rousseau, shamefacedly, and I've certainly never read a biography of him. He's a interesting character, a flawed man. I knew that. But go ahead, carry on.
I've got to listen to that. I think Rousseau is the most interesting man of the 18th century. He's just had an extraordinary life. And he's a good example because there are a few good books about him in English. But a couple of weeks ago, I read this biography by a guy called Maurice Cranston, which is the definitive 3-volume Life of Rousseau. It's great, but it's not easygoing. And then there's another wonderful book, kind of popularizing philosophy book called Rousseau's Dog, about how Rousseau and David Hume had an almighty falling out. It's an amazing story. Oh, yeah. And reading those 2 books together, you sort of absorb more than twice as much. You think you should be getting twice as much information, but somehow you're acquiring information and reinforcing it at the same time. And it's an extremely good tip. It sounds sort of basic, but it's much better than it sounds, I think.
The other point, and I do that here on EconTalk, I'll do 3 or 4 episodes on a single topic, not exactly the same topic, but related. And there's a cumulative effect, as you're saying, even though podcasts are flawed. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think one of the most important things about thinking is connecting. And when you read 2 different books, 2 different voices, 2 different authors, 2 different approaches, it's not just like, oh, I get a more thorough appreciation or I'm more likely to remember it. You get, as you say, almost a much richer grasp of some of the topics.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a little bit like, they say the best way to learn is to teach a subject. Yeah. As soon as you've had to explain a subject to a class, you know it much better than you would from reading a book. And it has something of the same thing, that you're getting 2 different perspectives on a field of knowledge. It's a real life hack. I know it sounds simple, but when you try it, it's really quite amazing, I think, actually.
And I think you argue that you shouldn't always read the book that's called, A History of Rome. You shouldn't just try to get the single most thorough overview. It's better to read 2 books that dig deeper into maybe different aspects or different time periods than a more general introduction.
Yeah, no, I think that's also really good advice, and advice that was given to me and that I've tended to follow. I've got a very noble friend who's always reading books called things like The 19th Century, and it's like 800 pages long, and he's just going to do the whole 19th century. And I'm just not convinced the human mind works that way. We have minds that look for the particular, we're interested in particular detail, we're often drawn to stories about human lives. And I think the long book about the 19th century that lists every war, trade controversy, famine, revolution, I think is unlikely to tell a story in a way that sticks. And I think often you need to find the individual story that will make you excited about the 19th century. But also, because every book is so dense and packed with information, the contextual information, even in what might seem like a relatively irrelevant book, will probably educate you more about the whole of the 19th century, for instance, if you're reading a Life of Gladstone or a particular, history of a war. You're still getting more contextual information than I think you would necessarily imagine.
It's a fantastic point. And in your discussion of one of the Rousseau biographies, you talk about all the other things you learned about beside Rousseau. Not that Rousseau isn't sufficiently interesting, but a lot of it had to be told to you along the way that you were able to grab. An example for me of that's rather, I think, extraordinary and undervalued in some dimension at least, is Robert Caro's biography of Lyndon Johnson. I'm older than you, and I used to see Lyndon Johnson on television when I was a little boy. I found him dreary and boring. He had a thick Southern drawl, and he spoke very slowly. He was not a great orator. And he was, after all, only president because this was my view as a child and then as a young, uneducated man. I thought, well, he got into the presidency because he was the vice president when Kennedy was shot. He wasn't that interesting. He's not a compelling figure. And so when people said to me, oh, you've got to read this biography, I thought, I'm not that interested in Lyndon Johnson. But the fact is, that book, which is now, I don't know how many volumes, 4 or 5, and still has one more to go, we hope, if Caro lives long enough to finish it. That book is an extraordinary history of the 20th century, especially the first half of the 20th century. You learn about Texas. You learn about electrification. You learn about electioneering. You learn about corruption. You learn a lot about ambition and power. And it's so much more than Lyndon Johnson was born on a sunny day in Beaumont, Texas, or wherever he was born. So I think that's a really important point. It's a fantastic point.
Yeah, and I think that book, the Robert Caro example, is a perfect example. Being British, I don't know an awful lot about American politics, but I think it's volume 3 of the Caro book, The Master of the Senate, starts with this unbelievably elegant essay on the history and purpose of the American Senate. It's a splendid piece of writing. For my money, one of the best pieces of political writing about America, or maybe any political system I've ever read. And you pick that up and you get that in a book that is not called the best thing you'll ever read about the American Senate. And I think that's the point about books, is they're just so dense with information. I think we live in a world where we're kind of assailed by information from every angle. But it's often quite decontextualized. It's often quite ephemeral. It doesn't really connect together. And I think the older I get, the more I'm amazed that you pick up a 300-page book and quite how much you can learn and quite how much stuff you get through in a book compared to, no offense, I love podcasts, but compared to a podcast, which have their uses, but the density of information in a book and the amount about the world that you can get from a book, it just blows my mind. The technology becomes more extraordinary to me with every passing year, I think.
But the point I think that you're making that underlies that observation, I think, is extreme. It's not just that there's a lot of information, because I think people may misinterpret that expression, and you talk about the information that's around us. It's true. A 300-page book has a lot of facts in it and a lot of background and so on. But the reason that I think a 300-page book is so extraordinary, if it's well done, is that you're spending time inside the mind of what you hope is a very interesting thinker. And you're reading a narrative. You're reading a story and a set of stories that have been woven together in the mind of a fellow human being. And it's absorbing that full tapestry and the story that person is telling and the emotion that person wants you to feel, which is so different than a tweet or a little, even a blog, a blog post or a Substack essay. You're entering a world if it's a good book, if it's a great book. And the opportunity to do that and grow from that and absorb it and carry it and connect it to the other books you've read and the things you're seeing in the world, that's where the power of books really comes from, seems to me.
Yeah, I think that's really beautifully put. And maybe the word I shouldn't have reached for wasn't dense, but perhaps rich. I think it's the richness of information, which maybe captures the narrative context, the joining together of ideas, all this stuff that books do as a matter of course. You can't have a book that doesn't do those things. That has just, in my opinion, been lost on social media. And the presence of social media just makes the richness of books even more extraordinary.
Yeah, and I think it's a different way of seeing your earlier point about the history of the 19th century. If I'm going to write a history of the 19th century that's a mere 800 pages, it's going to have to be this happened, and then that happened, and then this happened, and that happened, at least if it's badly done. But it's exhaustive, or only the important things are covered, of course. But that's not a great book. A great book is, I'm going to give you a narrative about why the 19th century is important through the activities of Gladstone or through the American Civil War or whatever it is. And I think I just haven't thought enough about this before. The idea that a book is a way that the author is forced to tell the narrative to you in the best way they can so that you'll absorb it is really what a great book is. Amazing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's another subsidiary point which is maybe worth making, which is that I'm never totally convinced. I'm sure it's sometimes the case, but the greatest thinker and writer about the 19th century, I wonder if that's the person who was drawn to publishing the book called The 19th Century, which just lists all the battles and wars in order. And I sort of wonder if you want the great writers, which I think should be your priority even for nonfiction, you want the people who can make it most exciting to you. They're perhaps not writing the kind of super comprehensive list of wars, battles, and kings type books, and they often will be a little more imaginative. One of my favorite books about the 19th century is Victorian Things by Asa Briggs, where he just lists Victorian stuff, the material world of the Victorians, chairs, tables, books, and things, and he just takes it that way. And I just think that's a sign, perhaps, of somebody who's got a bit more of, an imaginative approach to a subject. It's by no means inevitably true. I do have a lot of books that, I've got a lot of books I love that are called things like the 18th century. But it's sometimes a little thing to bear in mind, I think.
So I have one more thought on this question. A friend of mine was a big Churchill fan, and he'd read most of just about everything. It's impossible, but he'd read many, many things about that Churchill had been written about Churchill. And I'd asked him once if the Martin Gilbert biography was worth reading. He said, well, sure, if you want to know when he went to the bathroom on Tuesday, October 3rd, 1943. And that's a parody of the point we're making, that just the listing of facts is not that important. And to say it a different way, I am not a Churchill scholar, obviously. I don't have the time or the interest to be a master of any of Lyndon Johnson or Churchill or Dostoevsky or whatever it is. But I've read a few books on Churchill. I've read maybe, I'm guessing, 4 or 5, either biographies or different observations about him. I've read his own history of the Second World War, which I strongly recommend, by the way. It's an extraordinary book, including the memos and the appendices, which I recommend very strongly as well. He's a brilliant writer. But what's fun about this is that I actually can't list many things about Churchill, even having read those books. I know he was involved in the Dardanelles. I know he was out in the wilderness. I know he was an early worrier about Nazi Germany. I know many, many facts, but nothing close to the kind of history that 19th century or 18th century that we've been making fun of. And yet, I know something of the man. And it comes from those different perspectives, narratives, stories, and so on that I've absorbed seriatim and have made an impression on me and have stayed with me.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. And I think there's a real bias. I think it's a kind of, people talk about our tendency to make computer metaphors of the mind. We're obsessed with computers, and we think the human mind should be like a computer. And I think there's a slight bias to thinking that you should read a book and then, as you say, the result of that reading should be that you just then are able to download everything you've read in conversation and bore people to tears with everything you've learnt about what Churchill said to his cook on the 7th of January or whatever, which is not the point of reading. And I think often what you're referring to is a sort of more holistic but somehow untouchable sense of Churchill in your head. That is a very rich sense, but you may not be able to explain every single part of that understanding as information in a conversation. Understanding and information are maybe a little bit different, I guess. I think it's a very good point that you make. I love the Roy Jenkins biography of Churchill. I'm sure that's one you've read.
No.
That's my favorite of the books about him. Although the slight downside as a British person is the more I read about him, the more I feel that he seems slightly disillusioning. He often comes across quite incompetent to me, and I think it's not what I should be thinking about our national hero.
But I think, a lot of people think it's the opposite. He's the national villain. I prefer I'm a big fan of the Manchester biography, which I think is one of the finest biographies ever written, period. It's a masterpiece. But I think the point, which is what you're saying, is that, a real human being, there are a bunch of people who love Churchill. Oh, yeah, he saved the West. There are a bunch of people who hate him. He killed a bunch of people in the famine. He let Indians starve. He's a colonizer. Those cardboard images of an extraordinary man are simplistic. And the more you read about a person, now it's affected by what you've gone through in your own life by the time you get to that biography and so on. It's complicated. But I think it's a beautiful thing that you now have a richer picture of him and his flaws and his inadequacies, his shortcomings. He didn't write about him very much. It wasn't his strong suit. But his biographers are allowed to do that.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. And actually, Churchill is a great figure to pick because he's someone who's so simultaneously frustrating and dislikable, and yet also so immensely charismatic and likable. And you can sort of think, oh my God, you dreadful, incompetent man, what on earth are you doing? Don't invade the Dardanelles. Don't do all these dreadful things that you're doing. And then you'll hear a little bit of his conversation. There's a great thing from early in his career when he's at a dinner party and he's sitting next to somebody and he says, "Madam, we are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm," which is just so disarming. And those two things about Churchill are true. He's a dreadful man, but utterly charming man. Genius, but incompetent. And only that you can only get that richness from a book. And that cannot come across on social media. And there's not a picture of Churchill you can derive, I really think, outside of a book. It's a view of the world that is only available in books, I think, of that complexity.
Yeah. So switching gears. Do you reread? Do you read books over again?
I do occasionally, not as much as I should. I think I still have that feeling that you have when you were looking at your father's bookshelves. I just think, oh my God, there is so much I want to know. I just picked up a book on medieval Europe for the first time today. Not something I know much about, and I was looking at it, all these lists of kings who ruled Pomerania or whatever, and I was like, I need to get started on medieval Europe. There's a long way to go. And that thought maybe inhibits me from rereading as much as I should. I think it's good to reread, and I think it may have a little bit of the effect of reading two books on the same subject at once. But maybe when I get a bit older, that's something I'll embark on. Are you an advocate for rereading?
Somewhat. I think it's fascinating to reread a book years later because you've changed. I have a friend who reads To Kill a Mockingbird every year. That's interesting. I don't advocate that for sure. But it's fun to go back to a book that you loved as a young person and reread it later. And you're often disappointed, but occasionally you're overwhelmed by how deep and profound it is, and you didn't appreciate it when you're younger. And I think that's amazing. I've made the point here many times, even if you're James Marriott and you read 2 books a week, that's 100 books a year. And if you read for 50 years, you might get a little longer, but 50 years is a good reading career. That's 5,000 books. You got to pick them carefully. Yeah. And some books are better that second time than a different book is the first time. So the idea of rereading a book, I'm not talking about my children who read many of the Harry Potter books 6 and 7 times. That was a comfort. It's not what we're talking about. But the idea that a great book, a truly great book, merits rereading when you're changed and older is, I think, very worthwhile.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think one of the kind of maybe point that we haven't made about books, but is worth making, is that when you pick up a great novel by Charles Dickens or Jane Austen or Henry James or whoever, what you're getting to do is spend time in the company of one of the greatest people or geniuses who have ever lived. And that's an extraordinary thing. And there are few people whose works represent a kind of, you get to sit down and get into conversation with one of the all-time geniuses the human species has ever produced. And yeah, I think that probably is worth doing twice. If someone said, oh, look, Shakespeare's in the next room. I know you spoke to him a couple of years ago, but do you want to come and chat again? I think you go, yeah, go on. Okay, let's see what Shakespeare's got to say. Even if he says the exact same thing to you again, it would be worth it. And yeah. I think that is worth bearing in mind. Although some of the more disposable nonfiction that I'm sure you're also obliged to plow through occasionally for your job, you may not always necessarily want to return to.
Yeah, for sure. Do you give away books of your own? If someone's in your home and sees one of your books, says, "Can I borrow this?" Do you let them?
Well, because I'm maybe this is a British thing, because I'm polite, I sort of wince and go, "Yeah, of course," and then sort of feel like a part of my soul has been pulled out for the rest of the day.
Because you'll never see it again.
Yeah. Would you give your books away?
Well, I do, because I'm married, and I'm married to a wonderful woman, and she thinks it's a bad habit to not lend out your books. When I explain to her that they never come back, she disputes that. I accept the fact that my empirical evidence may be colored by my personal biases. I do not keep a rigorous spreadsheet about this, so I'm open to the fact that the possibility that I might be wrong. But because I love my wife and I respect her as well, a long time ago, I decided to always say yes and to just assume I'll never see it again. And then I just buy another one. Now, if it's a book I've written comments in, which I never did when I was younger, so that's generally not a problem on average, I might say, no, it's got my personal copy. I want to keep it. And besides, you won't want to read it with all my notes. You want to read it fresh and clean. But I like, and then I think, well, it's kind of nice. They respect my library and my taste sufficiently that they want one of my books. They claim they'll be giving it back, and I know otherwise, but that's okay. And if I really cherish it, I'll just buy another copy. And that's happened to me a number of times. It's okay.
That's lovely. I've also discovered that I'm a hypocrite. Every time I send a friend a text saying, look, you went off with that book of mine 3 months ago and I haven't seen it, they're immediately able to reply to me saying, well, that's interesting because I lent you a book 3 years ago. And I see it every time I visit, and it's on your shelf, and you've made no move to give it back to me. So, I'm as guilty of taking books as I am of giving them away.
Well, that's the other thing.
Something I was intrigued to ask you that you mentioned making notes in books, which I tend not to do. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a case for it? A lot of people I respect as readers do take notes and underline.
I regret that I did not take notes in the books that I loved, and especially the books I struggled with. The books that I have a difficult time understanding, I'll read them through once, and I found often I wouldn't take a note. The second time through, I try to summarize often at the end of a chapter what I think the author was saying or to emphasize passages. I tend not to go back now that I've started to write in books. By the way, I viewed it as a sacrilege to write in a book when I was younger, and I never bent down a page. And in fact, I never cracked the binding. I mean, when I would read a book, you could put it back on the shelf when I was done, and you wouldn't know I'd ever opened it. But I changed my attitude as I've gotten older. And even though I generally don't go back to the books that I have underlined and annotated, I think something happens in the brain when you do that. I think I wouldn't want to assume that that's a waste of time because I don't remember them any directly. And I don't go back, I don't go back and review those notes.
That's really interesting. I'm jealous of your pristine books. When I put a book back on the shelf after I've read it, it looks like I kicked it out the window into the mud, stamped on it, fed it to the dog, retrieved the tattered corpse of what was once a lovely book, and then returned it to the shelf. Some interesting advice I've had that I occasionally try and follow. I think the critic James Wood says, if you're a kind of new reader and you are reading a classic novel and you're not quite sure what to get out of it, try and underline one sentence per page. Underline one line per page. And that's just a way of focusing your concentration on a book. It's a way of kind of sharpening your perceptions of it. And I think that might be good advice. It's again, advice that I haven't followed, but I think it sounds like it could be useful.
I think that's what you do with a bad book, because I find with a really good book, I just want to underline every sentence. So the idea that I'd limit myself to one, but I do love that idea. But it's a really nice version of it is, you read a page and you say, what's the best sentence on this page that's worth maybe coming back to? It's a beautiful idea.
Yeah, and I think especially because I'm such a fast and greedy reader, my problem is often I should slow and pay more attention. I think it could be good discipline for me.
Is there a book that stands out for you as a book that you have given away often? Is there a book you've given away the most times?
That's a really good question. Maybe it's a mark of my own meanness that I'm struggling to think of something.
Not of your own, not of your library. Just if you want to give.
What is the one for you? You say.
Well, so I have a few, and I'm going to make a sad observation about this habit. So I have one book I give away pretty often now, and I have two books I used to give away all the time, and I'm going to tell you why I stopped. So the book I give away pretty often now is Some by David Eagleman. And if you're at home listening and you haven't read Some, it's short and lovely and thought-provoking and quite extraordinary. The book I've given away the most in recent years is Siobo There Below by László Krajnahorkai, the Hungarian novelist. This is a book that we may talk about it later. I wanted to bring it up, and you'll see why if we get to it. But this is a book that somebody gave to me who I respect, and I thought, okay, I'm going to give it a shot. I read the first page. I hated it. I read the first 5 pages. I hated them. And I thought to myself, this is the kind of book I've always hated, and it's pretentious. The first 5 pages, maybe the first 8 pages, are a single sentence. And it just keeps going. And it's like, this kind of modern literary shtick. Just tell the story. And there's no story, by the way. And so I read that first chapter, and I thought, I'm going to have to tell my friend I hated his book because I don't like to lie. And so I thought, I'll give it another chapter. And I liked it a little bit more. And although the long sentences of multiple pages didn't change, and although nothing really happens in the book, it's one of the most extraordinary reading experiences I've ever had. It is a book about beauty. It's a book about art. It's a book about religion. It's a book about the East. It's a book about Christianity. It's an extraordinary book. So I'm on fire about it. By the time I get to the end of it, and by the way, there's at least 2 chapters that are laugh out loud funny. The chapters don't go together, by the way, another modernist thing I hate. I don't care. They're not numbered consecutively, by the way. It's a Fibonacci series, just to make me even madder. But by the time I get to the end of the book, I'm thinking, this is one of the finest things I have ever read. And I started giving it to people because people often are interested in my opinion. And so I gave it away to a bunch of people. None of them could read it. Not one person. And I think I've given it, let's see, to at least 3 people. And I think maybe a 4th. Nobody said, I didn't like as much as you did, but nobody said, and I asked them, I said, did you read it? Yeah, I couldn't. I said, I know. So I stopped giving that away. I still like to rave about it, as I just did. Similarly, I used to give away The Fatal Conceit by F.A. Hayek a lot. It's 113 pages. Short. It's a great book to give away. People wouldn't read it. I used to give away the Caro biography. And again, it's like, why'd you give this to me for? It's 600 pages. There's the first volume. 600 pages of a guy I'm not interested in, and it only gets up to his first election or something.
Yeah, he's left school by the end or something.
Yeah, exactly. He's weaned by the end of the 600 pages. So I would say my record as a recommender is mixed at best.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It makes me think that I don't often recommend books, because I guess when you recommend a book, you're kind of giving someone, a task of how many hours it takes to read a book?
Depends.
10 hours, potentially, if it's a long book.
Yeah.
And I guess that's, you have to be pretty certain that someone's going to like it. I do have a carefully honed selection of ultimate absorbing novels to read on holiday, which I'm often asked for holiday reading recommendations. I give them, and then I've sort of incorporated the feedback. And I keep thinking this should be a Substack post for me at some point, because it's the culmination of about 10 years of telling people what to read on holiday, taking their feedback, absorbing it, refining the list. And I think I've got a really kind of beautiful list of absorbing novels to read on holiday, which is only about 6 novels long. But I think those might be the books that I really would confidently recommend to people, and have often many times.
It's a special genre, by the way, right? It's a certain sweet spot of a vacation novel that it's got to be a page turner, and it can be pretty superficial, but it really should have a payoff at the end of an emotional kick, set of life lessons learned. Yeah, just to take an example, I love Gilead by Marion Robinson. It's not vacation reading. It's just not. So I'm not going to recommend that for those of you thinking about what to read this in the coming months. But what's a great beach read, which is kind of a special vacation genre in and of itself, is a bit of an art. I'm looking forward to that post. I won't spoil it. You could give me one. Can you give us one now?
Yeah, no, I can give you a couple. I'll tease it because I've got a few of them. The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen is on it.
Okay.
Nobody's ever regretted taking that book on holiday in my experience.
Okay.
Beautiful little novel called Breathing Lessons by Anne Tyler. Highly recommend. I always put The Line of Beauty by Alan Hollinghurst on that list. Those are 3 books that I'd say are very moving, cool, very involving. And
I haven't read any of them.
Oh, go on holiday. Take 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Actually, they're so absorbing and page turning. You get through those 3 in a week, I think, on the beach.
In your essay, you make a reference to Elena Ferrante. Is she in your vacation list?
Yeah, she is. I love Elena Ferrante. I was actually questioning myself whether it was worth including, because so many people have read those books. It's like, saying to somebody, by the way, did you know that pizza's nice? And everybody knows that. Everybody knows that Elena Ferrante is excellent.
Well, I actually would recommend against it for vacation reading. I only read the first one, My Brilliant Friend, right? It's the first one in the trilogy. It's so stressful. It's an extraordinary book. But it's so dark and it's so stressful. I do not recommend it for vacation reading. But James, when your blog post comes out, you'll make the opposite case.
It's true. I remember I think my girlfriend read one of those books on holiday, and she just sort of exited the holiday. You just disappear into what is going to happen to this Neapolitan lady in her unbelievably complicated life.
Can you point to a book or two that you feel had an outsized impact on you as a thinker or as a human being?
God, that is a difficult question. There's one book that I always think, it's a kind of cliche to say this book changed my life, but there is one book that literally did change my life. Yeah. When I was at school, I was taken on a school trip to decide whether you could decide to apply, if you're selected, to go to Oxford or Cambridge. Those are your 2 options, the kind of top universities in the UK. And we went to Cambridge, and I immediately walked into a bookshop, which is my habit. And I picked up a book from a shelf called A History of Reading by Alberto Manguel, which is just a lovely book about the history of reading. It's beautiful. And I sort of sat down in this bookshop, and I just got completely absorbed in it. And I kind of looked up and I was like, oh my God, I've missed the entire day trip to Cambridge. Looks like I'm going to Oxford. So that literally, that did shape the path of my life.
That's a cheat. But it's a good cheat.
I think that's the most honest. I think that's the most honest answer. There are a couple of books that I think have, I guess because I'm a humanities person, insights from the sciences, I always sort of tend to blow my mind and I find very formative. A book called The Weirdest People in the World by Joseph Henrich, who is an anthropologist and a psychologist, really transformed the way that I think about people, the way that I think about human cultures, the way that I think about why we in the West are so individualistic. It's a long book, but it's really brilliant. It's one of those kind of explains everything books, and that's had a very big impact on me. That's less of a cheaty answer, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
What about you? Are you going? If you
I've talked about it a little bit before, so I will be brief. I remember reading a book called The Social Contract by Robert Ardrey. I was about to go off to graduate school, and that book blew my mind. I don't even know if I'd like it now. I might hate it. But it opened up the reason it, quote, changed my life isn't because of the content of the book, but because of what it did to my brain. And I thought, wow, what an extraordinary experience to enter into that worldview, which is very distinctive. It was a theory of everything kind of book, and which generally I hate the older I get, by the way. So read them now when you're young, James, because you'll still appreciate them.
I don't want to get disillusioned, but I fear it's probably coming, isn't it? The world isn't simple enough to be explained in a book.
Exactly, it's coming. But anyway, but you take something from it. And so that book, just reading it, I realized, wow, wouldn't it be an amazing thing if I could write a book like that someday? And it encouraged me to become an author, but it also encouraged me to think about in a more holistic, synergistic way. It was really an extraordinary read. I don't know if, The Three Languages of Politics by Arnold Kling, which we've had at least 2 or 3 episodes about it on this program, is a book that changed the way I think about politics and ideology. There's probably others. It's an uneasy question to answer off the top of your head because most of the impact of any one book is hard to parse out. But it's an interesting question. I want to talk about. I want to talk about a quote you have from Boswell, his Life of Johnson. It's about Johnson's view of reading. For general improvement, a man should read whatever his immediate inclination prompts him to, though to be sure, if a man has a science to learn, he must regularly and resolutely advance. He added, what we read with inclination makes a much stronger impression. If we read without inclination, half the mind is employed in fixing the attention. So there is but one half to be employed on what we read. Now, that's a fascinating idea. I don't know if it's true, but I love the idea that you should read what you're drawn to, what appeals to you, and what you'll be immersed in, and what will grab your attention. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. That book, Boswell's Life of Johnson, is so full of brilliant ideas about reading. Dr. Johnson was probably one of the great readers in history, and he's wonderful on it, these quotes that Boswell collects about what he said. I think that's I think it's a great quote. I think it's really true, which is that you can spend a lot of time thinking, I really should know about the French Revolution. I don't feel any particular inclination, but I feel embarrassed in conversation. People start talking about Robespierre and I've got little to contribute. I'm going to force myself through it and get to know it. And I think Johnson is right. I think if you're forcing yourself through a book, you're often not picking it up. And you should give yourself a little bit of freedom. Reading isn't totally a chore. It should be a pleasure. And if you read what you're interested in, you will absorb it better. And you'll take it on board. And you could force your way through a 400, 800-page history of the French Revolution and pick up nothing because you're hating it. And you could find a book that may have a few incidental remarks on the French Revolution. It's that richness of books we're talking about. A good nonfiction book, you're never going to learn nothing. You might learn a lot more about the world than its title would imply. And I think a certain kind of, read according to your inclination, because you'll take more in that way. Although I think Johnson would have added that he would have disapproved of, fripperies like cheap novels, and reading a quarter inclination for Dr. Johnson is, I think, there's a certain standard implied there as well.
So 2 things. One is I've never read Boswell's Life of Johnson. I have a listener, I think it's a listener, who told me it's one of the greatest books ever written. I bought it and I struggled to get through it. I'm going to try again because of your encouragement. The second thing is I want to disagree a little bit about your statement about nonfiction books. It's because you don't have a podcast, do you? So as a podcaster, I get a lot of books sent to me where the editor or the PR person, the marketing person tells me that this book is going to change the way I fill in the blank, lead, manage, make decisions, run my life, whatever it is. And that could be an interesting book. Usually not, because most people have very little to say about it. That they might have an essay, but to turn it into a book is hard. But then they always have to say, and it's not just the author's opinion on these things, it's based on science. And they'll always have these, quote, studies, and it drives me insane because some of those studies I know are not reliable or not true, don't replicate, and they're treated like they're true. And so you can get a very false idea from some nonfiction books these days. I think that's a modern phenomenon. I think the kind of books that you like to read, I suspect, are books from longer ago than this phenomenon. This is it's a very specific thing. We're not going to name names, but it's where a person typically takes a set of studies from the social sciences, which are iffy at best, and then treats them like they're all true and weaves a story about them and tells you why this is going to change your life. And I hate most of those. Sorry.
No, I think you're right too. In reference to your point about Boswell's Life of Johnson, find a good abridged version. There's a lot in that book about Dr. Johnson's Anglican piety, which I think first-time readers aren't necessarily going to be totally thrilled by. But a really good abridged version, of which Penguin over the years has produced some really good versions, I think is a totally honourable way into it, to get the best of it, and then come back and take the full thing in a more leisurely pace. Sorry.
I have read all 3 volumes of the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. There is a 1-volume abridgment. I cannot recommend it. It could be fine, but I have a huge moral aversion to abridgments. Now, in that case, he may have approved it, which is somewhat better. I don't see you reading abridged books, James. This is a shocking
I know.
confession.
Well, I'm going to I'm damaging the reputation carefully cultivated by that Substack post. I agree, and I would not usually say to read an abridged book, but I do think because Boswell's Life of Johnson is essentially a book of anecdotes. It's a book of there's not necessarily a narrative flow.
Fair enough.
You get through his life eventually. I think if you're struggling to get a way in, it's an incredibly long book, and I think a good abridgment can just set that book alight for you, and then you kind of get it, and then you come back. And I think in that instance, it's valid. In regard to your point about recent books, I totally agree. One of my jobs at the Times is as a book critic, and there's a lot of shoddy nonfiction. I want to run this past you actually. This is another theory that I threw out in this Substack post, which is that I think there is a sweet spot of popular nonfiction that exists between about, my dates I put in it were about 1960 and about 2006. In my mind, the books that bookend that sweet spot are a biography of James Joyce by a guy called Richard Ellman, which is one of the founding brilliant modern biographies, and another, God, not to bang on endlessly about Rousseau, one of my obsessions, a brilliant biography of Rousseau called Leo Damrosch. It's a great popular but scholarly biography. And I have a sort of theory that books written in between those two dates are in a kind of sweet spot of accessibility and professionalization. Everything before about not everything, ludicrous overgeneralization, many popular nonfiction books before 1960, I often think can be a little woolly, a little old-fashioned, written by men with large beards sitting in the British Museum reading room, also trying to write 12 book reviews at the same time, which is certainly a lot of English literary culture. Everything after about 2006, I sometimes think that this isn't universally true, but after about 2006, I'm just aware that people are checking their phones and they're writing books. Maybe if they're academics, they've been sort of too steeped in academic jargon. I also do think, and you may not agree with this, but I do think that when I think of some of my favorite writers, like the historian Peter Brown, historian of late antiquity, he was born, I think, at the end of the 20s or in the early 30s. And he had a kind of experience of reading as a child that is irreplicable nowadays. He would have read constantly, and he would have just absorbed on a sort of cellular level books. And he would have read as a child. He would have read extremely widely in adolescence in a way that I'm not sure it's possible for people to do, perhaps. Maybe you get rare instances. And I just think that richness of reading experience that I maybe ended in maybe it wasn't quite the same after the 70s. I sort of think that people who had that richness of immersion in literature that is maybe harder to get in modern society tend to write the really brilliant books on various subjects. It's not universally true, but it's something that I often bear in mind.
Well, it's especially important when we're talking earlier. I recently took a trip to Rome, and I realized I don't know enough about Rome, and I don't know enough about the Catholic Church. I'd been to the Vatican, and I'd walked through a number of churches, and as a result of that, I picked up an extraordinary book called Constantine's Sword, which is by James Carroll. It's about the history of the church's relationship with the Jews. But it's very specific to that, and it's not what I wanted. So I wanted to find an overview, and I was surprised how hard it was. I went on ChatGPT. I said, what are some of the best books? And I think when you get a list, as you said, I think sometimes the most recent ones are contaminated by academic fads, perhaps. Some of them are pretentious as well, because being popular is sometimes seen as a negative. And it may be that in earlier times that was not as true. I don't know. But I think there are sweet spots. I think I wouldn't be surprised if there were eras where certain types of writing were prized, and people who wrote that way grew up in a certain milieu of reading, as you suggest with Peter Brown. React to that, and then I want to come back to Peter Brown. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. And the point about genres is a really good one. Literary biography, something I love reading about, the lives of writers. I'm not sure the publishing industry can sustain great literary biography in a way that it would have done 50 years ago. There just isn't the audience for it. So other people I love to read, Richard Holmes, who wrote biographies of the poets Shelley and Coleridge. He started out after university. He sort of thought, I'm going to become a literary biographer and write biographies of poets, and that's pretty much how I'm going to make my living. I'm going to produce a book on Shelley that's this fat. A book on Shelley is probably a little bit too long. It's like 700 pages. And that was his life. That's not a financial decision anybody can make anymore.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that means that you just don't attract certain talented people into that field. Would a publisher even commission a 600-page popular biography of Shelley anymore? That probably wouldn't be the case.
Zero chance.
Yeah.
But that brings up my next question, which is, there's a certain snobbery in modern urban life, especially, of finding the obscure restaurant that no one else knows about that has the best fill in the blank, dim sum, tacos, whatever it is. And in literature, that's also somewhat true. I just mentioned, Laszlo Krasznahorkai was going to be one of my examples. How good could he be if I've never heard of him? I've never even heard of him. Well, I was a snob, and I was arrogant, and I was wrong. And I'm struck by the fact, first of all, so many people I read from that sweet spot, those 80s and 90s, where I'm thinking, I was alive when this book came out. How did I miss it? It's so good. Did I not listen? Did people not talk about it enough? Was I not in the right circles? And I do think there's an enormous volume of undervalued, underappreciated authors for all of us. And they're all different for all of us because we have different tastes and backgrounds and so on. But it strikes me that you need to be open-minded about it. And despite my claim that, you should only read the greatest books because you can only read 5,000, a lot of times the books that are best for you to read, or that are going to open your mind to Shelley, to take an example, because I don't think I will ever read a biography of Shelley, but now the odds have gone up dramatically from 0 to at least 3%, is that you don't know everything. And it's remarkable how many talented writers there are. You mentioned Peter Brown. You mentioned Claire Tomlin in your essay. I've never heard of either of them. And as a result, I've downloaded samples from their books. And Claire Tomlin looks like a lovely memoir. She's 91. I don't think she's going to be an EconTalk guest, to my disappointment, but you never know. Why do you like Peter Brown, and why do you like Claire Tomlin? Make the case.
So those are two, I'm pleased you mentioned them, because those are two great writers who I think everyone could appreciate. Peter Brown, I think the book to start with is a book called The World of Late Antiquity, quite a slim book. And his subject is that period, which I knew nothing about, between the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Middle Ages. And it always it had been in the back of my mind that what happened then? What was happening in Rome in the...
Nothing. That's why it's not worth reading.
What's happening in Rome in, the 600s or the 700s.
Yeah.
And I picked up this book, The World of Late Antiquity. And Peter Brown, I started tweeting excitedly about how brilliant and lucid and insightful this book was. One of those writers who every single sentence is genuinely full of thought. There are no idle sentences. And he's applied this huge intelligence and this huge, amazingly elegant prose style to this sort of obscure period of history. I started tweeting about it, and everyone was going, "You idiot! He's our greatest living historian in Britain. Nobody is better. People who know about history." And he's got an even longer book, which is maybe if you love the world of late antiquity, called The Rise of Western Christendom, which takes the
Yeah.
same period
Well,
and goes through it again.
I got the sample for that one because of what I just said.
Yeah, and I think you'd love it. I think he's such a lucid, clever writer. Claire Tomalin is a great literary biographer. There's an argument that she might be the greatest living literary biographer in Britain. The book to read by her, in my opinion, is her biography of Samuel Pepys, which is just an utterly charming book. It's a great subject for biography because Pepys wrote down everything he did every day for most of the days of his adult life with incredible candor about all his sort of naughty escapades.
Yeah.
Some beautiful writing in there too. And Claire Tomalin is just such an unbelievably compelling advocate for Pepys as a personality. That was another book I remember picking up in a university library and just sort of thinking, oh my God, just being completely absorbed and losing 4 hours to it. And her biography of Charles Dickens is fantastic, another incredibly interesting life. And her biography of Thomas Hardy is also really good. Her book on Pepys, though, is wonderful, probably one of my favorite books.
Have you read any Stefan Zweig?
I'm a little bit of a Stefan Zweig skeptic. I love his memoir, The World of Yesterday. That's a really wonderful book.
Extraordinary book.
I'm not totally sure that I really think that his fiction is of marvelous quality, but what do you think?
So, for those who don't know of him, and I did not know of him until fairly recently, another embarrassment, I just would mention, first of all, again, his memoir, The World of Yesterday, is an extraordinary book for 10 different reasons. It's full of insight. His life is unbelievable. His observations between the wars and the rise of the Nazis. It's an incredible book. In 1930, he was the most famous author in the world, which is sobering, given how few people have heard of him and how few people read him. But he sold millions and millions of copies. It was incredibly popular. I sympathize. I love some of his short stories, but not all of them. And I don't love him generally, but I've just dipped in. I've read maybe, 10 or so short stories. He's interesting, but his memoir, I think, is very important. But I mention him because he wrote a number of literary biographies, extremely short. His one of Montaigne is fantastic. I enjoyed it immensely. I'm trying to remember I've read 2 or 3 others.
I like Nietzsche as well, I think.
Say again?
He's got a book on Nietzsche.
I have not read that.
I didn't think was marvelous again.
Okay, fair enough. And he was very much, a popular writer. He maybe doesn't do justice to him. I don't know. Let's turn to fiction. We've talked a lot about nonfiction, a little bit about fiction, but I want to give a wonderful quote from John Kerry about great works of literature. Here's the quote. "They do not tell you what the truth is. They make you feel what it would be like to know it." That's a marvelous quote. I'll read it again. Great works of literature, and then here's the quote, "do not tell you what the truth is. They make you feel what it would be like to know it." Explain.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. That's from a wonderful book that he wrote called What Good Are the Arts, which is a little bit controversial, and he takes the piss out of things like the opera quite a lot. But his advocacy for literature in that book is one of the greatest arguments for reading I've ever read. And what he's getting at in that quote, I think, is a crucial difference between fiction and nonfiction. And a lot of these reading guides, which you can find online, I think are preoccupied with books as sources of information. Read a book about the French Revolution, know about the French Revolution, you have the facts at your fingertips. And what John Kerry is arguing for in fiction is a kind of understanding that I think we're often we tend to underrate, I think, which is a kind of emotional understanding. It's one thing to be told something is true, and you can say, oh yeah, I know when the French Revolution happened. It's another thing to have had a sort of emotional experience of truth. The example I gave in the essay, which I think is a kind of, I always find a useful way to try and explain the idea, is to do with Elena Ferrante, her books about young girls growing up in Naples in the 50s. And it was a sort of powerfully interesting experience for me because I'd been told a lot about what it was like to be a teenage girl. Everybody knows it's suddenly disorienting sexual attention of men. It's kind of difficult time in your life. These are cliches that everybody could tell you about being a teenage girl. But I read those Elena Ferrante books, and I suddenly sort of understood it, and I thought, oh, I get it, in a way that would never occur to me that it was this thing was there for me to get. And everything I would tell you after having read those books about being a teenage girl would be exactly the same. But I sort of feel like I have this kind of emotional understanding of it, which is incredibly important. And I think it's very underrated, actually. I think people think that ability to feel your way into something, it doesn't matter as much as repeating the facts about it. I think this about, the way that a novel by Trollope could show you about the truths it could show you about a large institution, for instance, in a novel by Trollope. He often writes about these kind of complicated institutions like the church or parliament. You can be told a load of facts about the church and parliament and how they work and who's in charge of who. But the experience of reading a novel that puts you through the emotional experience of that institution, you suddenly have this feeling of what it's like to be part of the church or parliament that is separate and deeper than merely being told the facts of it. And I think that's a kind of understanding we underrate.
So Trollope is underrated generally. I just would put in a plug for Can You Forgive Her, if you've never read Trollope. Extraordinary writer. And it's a puzzle why Dickens, I love Dickens, but why Dickens is alive and well in English literary circles, not academic ones, but people like to read Dickens, but I don't think they read much Trollope anymore, which is too bad because he's a master. I think the other thing you get from Trollope, by the way, is a portrait of ambition, a portrait of corruption, a portrait of ethical dilemmas, which, again, you can read. It's not bad to read the Caro biography of LBJ. You get that in there too. But fiction can somehow put it in your bones. And of course, the reason that Caro's book is powerful is because he writes it like a novel.
Yeah.
He's giving you a portrait of Johnson that is much more than just he did this and then he did that. He's getting inside Johnson's head, and he does that through interviews with Johnson's colleagues, through Johnson's own writing, through the news of the day. And he's weaving it's as if you're sitting in the room while he's got Johnson on the couch. And a great novelist can do that too. And that's why Caro's book is so, I think, profound. So I think there's something, great novels are not just entertaining. They do change the way you feel about yourself, the way you see your position in the world, what you might aspire to, your understanding of the people around you. Sometimes it might be a person you're not, like a teenage girl, and other times it's like someone who's just like you, but you've never really looked carefully at yourself. And when you read that novel, you realize, oh, he's talking about me.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. It's that way that I sometimes think feeling can be more complex than thinking. You can sort of, sometimes a great novel...
It's underrated.
Yeah, and especially, again, in our society that I think tends to think that human brains should function like computers. But the feeling you can get from a great novel can often be an extremely complex and profound one that I think that informs you much more about the world than reading 100 facts about the world.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, which I unfortunately agree with you, that podcasts are a pale technique compared to reading a book for mastering something, understanding something, absorbing something. You say generally, it's a quote, you say generally podcasts and summarizing apps are useless as shortcuts to information. Books remain the best technology ever invented to understand life in the world. There is no alternative. Putting aside the cheap shot of podcasts, but I do agree with you. Talk about what I would call, I don't remember if you use this word or not, but it's what I think about is grappling. You know, when you read a serious book, Siobo There Below is an extreme example, but even Dostoevsky, a writer who stood the test of time, there are passages, as I think you mentioned, that you're going to struggle to get through them. You may be bored, you may not understand the context, you may lack the background for some of the things that are being discussed, but oftentimes you're being presented with an idea that you've never encountered, and you've got to grapple with it. Grapple with it in the sense of first understanding it, and then seeing what's significant about it. And I think about that a lot in the world of AI that we're entering, and how AI is an anti-grappling device. It just says, too hard for you. I'll explain it. Yeah, tell me in a paragraph. Tell me in 2 paragraphs. Tell me in a page what this book is about. And that's a tragedy. I'm very concerned about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the point you make is a really good one. I often feel this way about poetry, actually. I love reading poetry, and I read quite a bit of it. And I always think every time you read a great new poet, you have to it will often seem bewildering. I remember reading Sylvia Plath the first time in my teens and thinking, this isn't poetry, this is just ranting nonsense. And I read her a bit, and I read her again and again and again, and I suddenly realized that I was being shown a whole new way of seeing the world that couldn't have been summarized, and it couldn't have been précédé. And I guess part of the kind of grappling process you're talking about, I think, is kind of having a bit of humility as a reader and saying, I'm being presented with something very different to what I've encountered before. And your brain will start fighting. You'll go, no, this isn't how it is. I know how it is. This is nonsense. And then you kind of learn to say, no, look, I'm going to sort of allow myself to be shown, and I'm going to put myself through the experience of this book, and it's going to be difficult, and it's going to be bewildering, and I may not like it often, but I will trust, because this person is a great writer, and people have told me this, that I will have my mind changed and my worldview changed by the difficulty of this process and by its strangeness. Obviously, not every book is going to show you a new world with its difficulty and strangeness. When those sort of shoddy social science books you referenced aren't going to do that. But I think with a great book, submitting to the difficulty and submitting to the weirdness is a really important part of the experience of reading. And the problem with AI is that you can just cut that bit out of it. You can cut the difficulty out of it. And the difficulty often is what is remaking your mind, I think. And it's very
for sure.
mad to me to cut that out.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating moment. Let's talk about poetry for a minute. So going back to my father had very strong feelings about what was good poetry and bad poetry, and he prejudiced me for a long time. Not a bad thing to start with. He was against most modern poetry, and so I read a lot of classic poets of the past. Like for him, I think T.S. Eliot was like there's nothing after T.S. Eliot.
Where it all went wrong.
Yeah, what?
Where it all went wrong.
Exactly. No, but he liked Eliot. But after that, it was a mixed bag, very mixed bag, a negative bag. And so it took me a long time to appreciate some modern poets. But I think what's fascinating about poetry is I think people misunderstand what poetry is about, and I think they think it's about emotion. And it is, of course. It is about feeling things that the poets want you to feel something often that they felt. But it's taken me a long time to realize that really great poetry is a way to communicate something ineffable, something that cannot be communicated otherwise. And what an extraordinary thing that is. I mean, it doesn't always work. And sometimes you can't access what that poet is trying to capture with those words. But a lot of the poems that, quote, don't make sense to you when you first read them are because they're trying to do something extremely difficult, which is to make you see something that's can't be described, or at least not easily.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's an idea that crops up in, I think, criticism of the Romantic era, where it was, does Schopenhauer say this, correct me if I'm wrong, that poetry can show you a kind of deeper layer of reality. Reality is composed of this sort of superficial layer, and there's a deeper layer underneath it. I'm not saying I believe this metaphysically, but it used to be common to talk about poetry as this thing that could kind of help you access this realm beyond our superficial material world into something more profound. Obviously, we can't really speak like that in our disillusioned 21st century world. That's how poetry often makes me feel. And like you, I struggle to say why I think it's so important, because it sounds ludicrous to say that poetry can show you a kind of deeper reality. That's probably, if you're to press me, that's how I feel about it. And it's the thing I would struggle hardest to make the case for, because I would find myself hard-pressed to say why it's useful. It's probably ultimately my favorite thing to do. It's the most consoling thing I can do. If I ever feel depressed or upset or worried, poetry is the thing that sort of feels like it sort of has restored me to some kind of wider plane of significance where everything else seems petty. It's incredibly important to me, but I find myself very hard-pressed to say why.
It's terribly out of fashion. Do you want to recommend 2 or 3 poets or 2 or 3 poems that you particularly like?
That's a good question. Two or three poets who I love. Philip Larkin. Anybody, if you're not a great poetry reader, Philip Larkin is very easily lovable. Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson, I absolutely love. Get a thin selected edition of his poems. They're extremely beautiful. If you love beautiful language, they're great. And yeah, I'll say Sylvia Plath, somebody who I do return to, and was somebody who I certainly dismissed in my teens and thought it was over emotional and ridiculous. And I remember it's one of those things where one comment can change your view of something. I had a teacher at university who said that Sylvia Plath was a little bit like expressionism in the visual arts. She was pushing language to its to its extremes all the time, in the way that expressionist painters might push color or emotion to extremes. And that really opens up for me. And she's someone who I had my mind changed on and was very glad to have had my mind changed on.
So I want to like Philip Larkin, and At Grass is, I think, a masterpiece. But I struggle often to enjoy many of his other poems. I have his collected poems, and I pick it up at times, and I try to read them, and they're hard for me. But many of them are accessible, and that one in particular speaks deeply to me.
At Grass is just a beautiful poem. It's a really lovely poem. One of my all-time favorites, I think. Who would you recommend poetry-wise? Is there someone you would say?
I like Ulysses by Tennyson.
That's just a wonderful poem.
I used to know it by heart. Miss Canine made me memorize it in 8th grade. I know chunks of it by heart still, which is lovely. I love the poems of two guests of EconTalk, Dwayne Betts and Dana Gioia, two modern poets. But I'm thinking about the poets that I read, just like you talk about, for consolation. Actually, I often read poems to be moved, to be touched, to feel something. I'm feeling, I don't know, the sterility of modern life, a poem that can give me goosebumps or can bring tears to my eyes is what I look for. And I can't think of any right now. So
I think sometimes that a good what really got me excited about poetry was just buying a book with a title. I know abused books with titles like this, an anthology of English poetry in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And just skim through it and see what lines jump out at you and go from there. And I think that's probably the best way, because poetry can be so personal, I think. You can't recommend something everyone will love.
I have a Evernote note called Favorite Poems. So I'm going to cheat and see what I wrote down here. What He Thought by Heather McHugh. The Writer by Richard Wilbur, an extraordinary poem. From Blossoms by Lee Young Lee. At Grass. The Ballad of East and West, which is Kipling. Summer Kitchen by Donald Hall is a masterpiece, and it's a secret. Robert Penn Warren. Let Evening Come by Donald Hall's wife. I'm blanking on her name. What's her name? Jane Kenyon. Great poem. The Art of Losing by Elizabeth Bishop. A lot of great, I get goosebumps just thinking about them.
I've read, of that list, I've read At Grass and I think nothing else. So I'm going to have to,
okay.
We're going to listen back to this and take notes.
Yeah, we'll put up links.
Excited.
And then just two popular songs that I love as poems. May I Suggest by Susan Werner and Heart Full of Holes by Mark Knopfler. I love both of those. Let's close with what you're reading now. What are you reading?
So you've caught me in between books. This morning,
what did you just finish?
I just finished The Wings of the Dove by Henry James.
Oh, wow.
It's very hard going.
Yes, it is.
Extremely hard going.
When you listed him with in your list of 3 of the greatest novelists of all time, I'm thinking, not so fast, but go ahead, make a case. It's a personal preference.
So yeah, and he was not a personal preference of mine, but he was one of those people with a towering reputation who I thought, I'm going to have to read him eventually. I read his most famous and probably his most accessible novel, The Portrait of a Lady, last year.
Yeah.
And I thought, there's a phenomenon called late James, which is kind of particularly intimidating, which is as he got older, his style became more and more convoluted and more incomprehensible. And The Wings of the Dove is a late novel of Henry James's. It is incredibly hard to get through. And By last week, I was removing myself to the local park without my phone, to sit on a hard bench, to force myself through these labyrinthine sentences in a state of sensory deprivation. It is, in the end, a very great and subtle and powerful and profound book. I'm extremely glad I read it. I think I'm going to read something a bit easier next. I'm reading this book, I can't remember the author, The Making of Europe, about medieval Europe, that was recommended to me. I'm not sure whether I will read it, but I'm sort of in a state of expectation. I'm going to try and find something after this.
Do you finish every book you start?
No. I have a general rule of thumb that if something is a classic like Henry James and I'm not enjoying it, I kind of think the problem is probably me, not Henry James. Well, actually, arguably Henry James is not a good example. Dostoevsky. If I'm not enjoying The Brothers Karamazov, which I have to say I slightly slogged my way through last year. I know I will try again, but I kept going because I thought, frankly, the problem here is me. It's not Dostoevsky. I'm the one who's at fault here for not enjoying it. Maybe it was, as you said, the wrong suggestion, the wrong translation. But if it's a kind of more lightweight, recent nonfiction book, I'll throw it aside totally without compunction.
Well, I will confess I didn't get to The Brothers Karamazov until I was in my, I think, late 50s or early 60s. So give it some time. Come back to it.
Let it breathe.
And by the way, I had many sections of that book where I was going like, who cares about this romantic dalliance? It's just not interesting. And similarly, to your point, making your point, people said, keep going.
Yeah.
The last 250 pages is a complete page turner of
yes,
a police procedural. It's a phenomenally entertaining book, but there are a handful of other parts of that book that are intellectually, emotionally, spiritually overwhelming to me. But your mileage may differ. And if you told me that Henry James is a genius and I missed out, I'd open my mind to it. So,
yeah.
Let's close with it's 2025. AI is on the rise. Books are a little bit under threat. I think that the experience you're talking about of turning off your phone, not being distracted, sitting on a bench, hard or soft, for an extended period of time doesn't come easily to most people these days, especially younger people. Try to make the case. You've made it in our conversation, but try to sum it up. Why should I make the effort? I've got so many other interesting things to do and so much more entertaining distraction. Why should I acquire the discipline that you're talking about?
I mean, I think the whole modern world is one big argument for the importance of books. Every time I log onto Twitter, every time I look at YouTube, every time, a short form video flashes across whatever screen, I just think this is so maddening and so decontextualized and so trivial that the argument for books is being made in front of my eyes. I remember there's a good tweet that always makes me laugh. The tweet just goes something like, putting aside my classic novel to check Twitter and read some of the worst stuff ever written by humans, which I think puts the dichotomy quite well. And I guess, it's everything we've talked about. It's the richness of books. It's the capacity of books to provide you with a holistic, joined up, rich, contextualized understanding of the world that is also emotional as well as purely intellectual. And maybe it's a kind of minor point, but somebody said to me recently, and I don't think there's nothing in it. A book is something you can finish. You can't finish anything in the modern world. You can't have a complete experience of Twitter. There's always more. But there's something about the way that a great book is a whole artifact that you can incorporate into your life. You finish The Brothers Karamazov, and it's there. You've done it. That whole thing, crafted as a whole, has been incorporated into your life. And I think in the modern world, we've lost that a bit. It sounds kind of minor, but it does strike me as true that so much scrolling is endless, and a book is a sort of whole artifact you can have in your life. Maybe that sounds silly.
I don't think so. My guest today has been James Marriott. James, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks very much for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.